You've been carrying prayers like precious glass, careful not to drop them, careful not to hope too loudly in case silence answered back. But today, God isn't asking you to strive, explain, or prove your faith. He's leaning close and whispering something simple that feels almost irresponsible after all you've been through. Relax. Not because the pressure wasn't real, not because the tears didn't count, but because heaven was never confused about your address. While you were rehearsing how it might fall apart, God was arranging how it would come together. While you were asking if you missed the moment, God was reminding time who He is. This word is for the tired believer who kept showing up anyway, the one who prays through clenched teeth, the one who prayed again even after disappointment tried to change your theology. There is a holy calm that comes when you realize delay is not denial and silence is not absence. God does His deepest work in unseen places, and often the answer is already moving before your emotions catch up. This sermon is not a push, it's a permission. Permission to loosen your grip, unclench your jaw, and let God be God. What you asked for did not intimidate Him. What you're waiting on did not get lost in translation. Heaven heard you the first time, and even now, things are aligning in ways you couldn't rush if you tried. There is a difference between waiting and worrying, and most of us were taught to confuse the two. Waiting says God is trustworthy even when I don't have updates. Worry says I need to stay tense in case God forgets. When God says relax, He is not dismissing the seriousness of your situation. He is confronting the strain you've been carrying as if it was your responsibility to finish what only He could start. You prayed, and prayer was not a suggestion box, it was a handoff. Something shifted the moment you released those words, even if your circumstances didn't immediately echo back. Faith doesn't always feel like shouting. Sometimes it feels like exhaling. The enemy would love for you to believe that your calm means you've given up, but heaven knows rest is often the loudest declaration of trust. You don't relax because nothing is happening. You relax because too much is happening for you to interfere. God does not need your anxiety as fuel. He is not powered by panic or pressured by deadlines. The same God who spoke worlds into order can manage your timeline without your micromanagement. When you relax, you're not stepping back from the promise, you're stepping out of the way. There are things God can only deliver when your hands are open instead of clenched. Some blessings require room, and worry takes up space faith was meant to occupy. You've been watching the clock, but God has been watching your growth. He's been strengthening your discernment, deepening your patience, expanding your capacity so you can sustain what you asked for. If it had arrived too early, it might have crushed you instead of crowned you. Relaxing is not ignoring the process, it's honoring it. It's choosing to believe that God is working beyond what you can see, hear, or feel. Every unanswered question is not a closed door. Sometimes it's God protecting your peace until the full picture is ready. You don't have to rehearse worst-case scenarios to be prepared. You are already covered. The answer is not lost, late, or lacking. It is moving with intention, carrying everything you need, arriving at the exact moment. It will bring God the most glory, and you the most freedom. Rest feels rebellious when you've been trained to equate exhaustion with faithfulness. Somewhere along the way, you learned that if you weren't tired, you weren't trying hard enough. And if you weren't anxious, you weren't taking life seriously. But God never asked you to prove your trust by burning yourself out. Rest is not quitting, it's consenting. It's agreeing with God that He can handle what you cannot. When you rest, you are not disengaging from the promise. You are declaring that the promise does not depend on your constant effort to survive. Rest is the moment you stop narrating your fear and start listening for God's reassurance. It is the holy pause that says, I've done what I can do, and now I will let God do what only He can do. There is a kind of rest that doesn't come from sleep, but from surrender, from knowing that even while your body is still and your mind is quiet, heaven is fully active. God is not impressed by your hustle, but He is honored by your trust. When you choose rest, you're saying that God's character is more reliable than your anxiety. You're choosing to believe that outcomes don't improve just because you worry louder. Rest challenges the lie that everything will fall apart if you stop holding it together. The truth is, some things fall into place only after you let go. Rest creates space for God to move without interference, without your second guessing, without your need to control the narrative. It's an act of worship to stop striving and still believe. Rest says I trust God even when I don't see progress, even when the silence stretches, even when my emotions are loud and my answers are quiet. The enemy wants you restless because rest exposes who you really trust. When you rest, you're not being passive, you're being precise, choosing peace on purpose, aligning your spirit with heaven's pace instead of forcing God to keep up with your panic. Rest is not the absence of faith. It is faith matured enough to breathe, faith confident enough to wait, faith secure enough to believe that God is still working even when you are not watching, checking, or chasing. Knowing that what God is doing in the unseen does not require your constant attention to be effective. Delay has a way of making you question things God never put up for debate. It whispers that maybe you asked for too much, believed too boldly, expected too soon. But delay is not God stepping away. It's God leaning in with intention. He is not withholding to punish you. He is preparing to protect you. What feels like waiting is often God strengthening the frame of your life so the blessing doesn't break you when it arrives. Delay doesn't measure your value. It stretches your capacity. It teaches you how to carry weight without losing wonder, how to hold hope without forcing outcomes. In the pause, God is refining your discernment, sharpening your voice, deepening your roots so you don't topple when elevation comes. You think you're being overlooked, but God is actually covering you, keeping you from doors that would have given you access without sustainability. Delay is where faith matures from desperation into confidence, where prayers shift from frantic to anchored. God uses the waiting to detox you from rushing, from settling, from confusing speed with success. What you're becoming in the delay matters just as much as what you're waiting for. If God rushed the promise, it might arrive before your character could steward it. Delay is not God saying no, it's God saying grow. It's the season where impatience gets confronted and trust gets cultivated. In the delay, God is teaching you how to be consistent without applause, faithful without feedback, obedient without evidence. He's building endurance so your joy won't be fragile and your peace won't be temporary. Delay strips away the need for instant gratification and replaces it with a deeper assurance that God is intentional with timing. You are not behind, you are being formed. The wait is not wasting your life. It is shaping your strength, aligning your heart, expanding your faith so when the promise finally meets you, you won't just receive it, you'll sustain it. Control feels like safety until it starts suffocating your faith. You hold tighter because you're afraid that if you loosen your grip, everything you prayed for will slip through your fingers. But faith was never meant to coexist with constant control. Faith begins where your need to manage outcomes ends. Releasing control is not losing responsibility, it's recognizing authority. It's acknowledging that God sees angles you don't, understands consequences you haven't imagined, and orchestrates outcomes beyond your reach. Control keeps you busy, but faith keeps you aligned. When you stop trying to dictate how the promise should arrive, you give God room to exceed what you scripted. Control asks, what if it doesn't work? Faith asks, what if God already handled it? Letting go exposes the places where fear dressed itself up as wisdom, where anxiety pretended to be preparation. God is not asking you to be careless. He is asking you to be confident in Him. Releasing control is an act of humility that says, my strength has limits, but God's power does not. The tighter you cling, the more exhausted you become, because you were never built to carry outcomes on your shoulders. Faith doesn't need you to hover. It needs you to trust. When you surrender control, you're not abandoning the promise. You're aligning with the process God designed to deliver it. There are breakthroughs that only happen after you stop interfering, blessings that require your hands to be open instead of clenched, peace that arrives when you finally accept that God's way may challenge your preference, but will always honor His purpose. Control demands certainty before obedience. But faith obeys even when the path is unclear. Letting go is where trust becomes tangible, where belief moves from theory into practice, where you stop negotiating with God and start agreeing with Him, where your soul learns that safety was never found in control but in surrender. Sometimes what you're waiting for doesn't arrive wearing the face you imagined, and that can feel like disappointment until discernment kicks in. We often pray with pictures already framed in our minds, convinced that God's goodness has to match our expectations to be valid. But God is not limited by your imagination. He is guided by your destiny. What's on the way may look unfamiliar because it's carrying growth you didn't ask for but desperately need. God answers prayers with wisdom, not just agreement. He sees the version of you that's coming and sends blessings that can sustain that future, not just satisfy your present craving. When the answer arrives differently, it's not God missing the mark. It's God protecting you from settling for something smaller than his intention. You asked for relief, but God sends transformation. You asked for provision, but God sends positioning. You asked for clarity, but God sends courage. Sometimes the miracle isn't in getting exactly what you prayed for, but in discovering that what God provided exceeds what you would have chosen if you knew what he knew. Disappointment often comes from comparison, from measuring God's response against your limited perspective. But when you trust God's character, you learn to trust his methods. The unfamiliar answer stretches your faith beyond comfort into confidence, teaching you that God's goodness isn't fragile. It doesn't depend on predictability. What's better doesn't always arrive easier. Sometimes it arrives deeper, wiser, stronger. God is not obligated to follow your blueprint when he's building something eternal. He answers prayers in ways that mature you, not just ways that please you. What looks like a detour may actually be the most direct route to wholeness. God's better often requires your patience, your humility, your willingness to release what you thought you needed so you can receive what you truly do. When you stop resisting the unfamiliar, you start recognizing God's hand in places you once questioned. The blessing you're about to receive may challenge your assumptions, but it will honor your prayers and exceed them in ways you couldn't have planned, because God's idea of better always carries purpose, longevity, and grace that reaches further than comfort ever could. Peace is not the pause between problems. It's the evidence that God is present in the middle of them. When peace shows up without permission from your circumstances, it's not denial, it's discernment. It's your spirit recognizing that something has shifted even if your environment hasn't caught up yet. Peace is often the first sign that God has already stepped into the situation ahead of you. Before doors open, before answers speak, before movement becomes visible, peace settles in your soul like an announcement from heaven that says this is handled. You don't have peace because everything makes sense. You have peace because God does. Peace doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you stopped panicking. It's the quiet confidence that comes when you realize you are not responsible for the outcome, only the obedience. When God is working, he guards your heart from unnecessary turbulence. Anxiety tries to convince you that urgency equals importance, but peace reminds you that God is never rushed. If something were truly falling apart, peace wouldn't be possible. The fact that you can rest, breathe, and still trust in the middle of uncertainty is proof that God has gone ahead of you. Peace becomes your internal confirmation when external confirmation hasn't arrived yet. It's heaven's way of saying you don't need to keep checking. Keep chasing, keep stressing. Peace doesn't argue with fear, it replaces it. It settles your thoughts, steadies your emotions, and anchors your hope so you're not swayed by every delay or distraction. When God is silent, peace speaks. It reassures you that silence is not neglect, it's strategy. Peace keeps you from forcing doors, rushing seasons, and making decisions out of desperation. It protects you from sabotaging what God is carefully aligning. Peace is not passive, it's powerful. It stands guard over your mind and reminds you that if God were worried, you would feel it. But since he's not, neither should you. The calm you feel isn't accidental, it's intentional. It's God's presence outweighing your questions, his assurance overriding your uncertainty, his sovereignty settling your soul, even when the path ahead is still unfolding. Chasing is what you do when you believe something can outrun God's authority. You move faster because you're afraid opportunity has an expiration date, and if you don't catch it now, it will disappear forever. But what God has already sent is not running from you. You don't have to prove readiness by exhaustion or devotion by desperation. When God releases a blessing, he also secures its arrival. You can't miss what's meant for you by moving at heaven's pace. The pressure to pursue comes from a lie that says scarcity rules your future, but God operates in abundance and precision. What he assigns to your life is drawn to you by alignment, not effort. You don't have to compete, compare, or contort yourself to attract what God ordained. Chasing often leads to settling, to grabbing what looks close instead of trusting what's correct. God's promises are not activated by panic, they are fulfilled by faith. When you stop chasing, you start noticing how God brings things to you in unexpected ways, through conversations you didn't plan, connections you didn't chase, doors you didn't knock down. Stillness sharpens discernment. It helps you recognize the difference between what is available and what is appointed. God doesn't dangle blessings just out of reach to test your stamina. He delivers them in his timing to protect your peace. If something requires you to abandon your values, exhaust your soul, or compromise your faith to obtain it. It's not from God. What is truly yours will meet you where obedience places you. You don't have to hunt for confirmation when God has already spoken. When you trust that God has gone ahead of you, you can walk, not run. You can move with intention instead of urgency. You can live from assurance instead of anxiety. What God has already sent is on schedule, fully secured, and moving toward you with purpose. And your role is not to chase it down, but to stay aligned, faithful, and receptive as it arrives right on time. Expectation is not impatience when it's rooted in trust. It's the posture of someone who knows God's character well enough to prepare without panicking. There is a difference between waiting with your arms crossed and waiting with your hands open. Expectation says, I believe God enough to make room for what he promised. Even if I don't know the shape, size, or timing yet, it's the quiet confidence that rearranges the furniture of your heart before the blessing knocks. God is drawn to expectancy because it reveals alignment, not entitlement. You're not demanding, you're discerning. You're not rushing God, you're agreeing with him. Expectation doesn't shout because it's sure. It doesn't beg because it believes. It lives in that sacred space between promise and manifestation where hope stays alive without becoming frantic. Many people miss the beauty of expectation because they confuse it with pressure. But biblical expectation is patient, grounded, steady. It wakes up each day believing that God is still good even if today doesn't look like delivery day. It holds joy without proof and peace without evidence. Expectation doesn't obsess over when, it focuses on who. When your expectation is anchored in God's nature instead of your timeline, it becomes a source of strength instead of stress. You stop rehearsing disappointment and start rehearsing gratitude in advance. You thank God not because you see it, but because you trust him. Expectation shifts your language. You stop saying if and start saying when. Not because you're arrogant, but because you're assured. You've seen God come through too many times to doubt his consistency now. Expectation guards you from cynicism, from letting past delays harden your heart and lower your faith. It keeps you tender, hopeful, and open even after life tried to make you guarded. Expectation says, I refuse to let disappointment have the final word. It chooses belief again, not because it's naive, but because it's experienced. Expectation also disciplines you. It teaches you how to prepare responsibly without obsessing emotionally. You show up, you stay faithful, you remain obedient, but you don't spiral when things don't move on your schedule. You understand that expectation doesn't control God, it cooperates with him. You don't rush doors open, but you stay ready in case God does. There is a readiness that comes from expectation, a spiritual posture that says, if God decides today is the day, my heart won't be cluttered with doubt. Expectation clears space. It removes the debris of fear, bitterness, and comparison, so when the blessing arrives, it has somewhere to land. Without expectation, blessings can feel overwhelming or suspicious. With expectation, they feel familiar, like something you've already greeted in prayer. Expectation doesn't mean you won't have moments of doubt. It means doubt won't be the loudest voice. You may question, but you won't quit. You may feel wary, but you won't withdraw. Expectation keeps you engaged without being exhausted. It allows you to live fully now instead of postponing joy until everything is resolved. You stop saying, I'll be happy when, and start saying, I trust God now. Expectation is what allows you to celebrate small signs without idolizing them. You notice alignment, confirmation, peace, and provision along the way, and you thank God without turning those signs into deadlines. Expectation understands process. It respects growth. It honors preparation. It knows that God often fulfills promises layer by layer, strengthening your faith as he goes. Expectation doesn't despise the unseen season because it knows roots grow underground before fruit shows up above. You don't need constant reassurance when expectation is strong. You don't need to keep asking God, are we there yet? You rest in the knowing that movement is happening whether you feel it or not. Expectation is calm because it trusts God's competence. It doesn't feel threatened by other people's progress. It doesn't rush because someone else received their blessing first. It knows that God is personal, precise, and intentional. Expectation keeps you from shrinking your prayers to protect yourself from disappointment. It gives you permission to believe boldly again, to hope freely again, to dream without apology again. It reminds you that God never criticized faith for being too big, only for being too small. Expectation keeps your spirit light even when your circumstances feel heavy. It anchors you in joy that doesn't depend on outcomes. It allows you to smile before the miracle, worship before the breakthrough, and thank God before the manifestation. Expectation is the language of faith that says, I'm ready without rushing, hopeful without forcing, confident without controlling, and at peace knowing that what God promised is not only possible, it is already in motion, already assigned, already secured, already approaching at the exact pace required to bless you without breaking you. Gratitude changes the way waiting feels because it shifts your focus from what's missing to what's already moving. When you thank God before you see the outcome, you're not pretending the need is gone. You're acknowledging that God is already involved. Gratitude is not a reaction to completion, it's a response to confidence. It says, I trust you enough to praise you while the answer is still unfolding. Complaints make waiting heavier, but gratitude makes it holy. It sanctifies the in between, turning the gap between prayer and promise into a place of worship instead of worry. Gratitude doesn't ignore the struggle, it reframes it. It reminds your soul that if God has been faithful before, he hasn't suddenly changed his character now. Every thank you becomes a marker of trust, a declaration that you believe God is consistent even when your circumstances are not. Gratitude steadies you when impatience tries to take over. It slows your breathing, softens your thoughts, and realigns your heart with truth. You stop asking why not yet and start saying thank you for what you're doing that I can't see. Gratitude keeps you from turning waiting into resentment. It protects your spirit from bitterness that can creep in when prayers take longer than expected. When you practice gratitude, you're choosing humility over entitlement. You're acknowledging that God owes you nothing, yet he gives generously anyway. Gratitude dismantles the lie that God is late and replaces it with the truth that God is intentional. It teaches you to recognize progress that isn't obvious, growth that isn't loud, and movement that isn't dramatic. You begin to notice how God sustains you while you wait, how he gives strength for today even before delivering the promise of tomorrow. Gratitude sharpens your spiritual eyesight. You start seeing answered prayers you once overlooked, protection you didn't recognize, delays that saved you from unnecessary pain. Gratitude reminds you that God has already done more than enough to earn your trust. When you thank God in advance, you're aligning your heart with heaven's perspective. Heaven celebrates what's already decided, not just what's already delivered. Gratitude pulls you into that celebration early. It allows you to participate in joy before the manifestation arrives. It keeps your faith from becoming transactional, where you only praise when you receive. Gratitude says God is worthy regardless of the outcome. It anchors your joy in who God is, not just in what he gives. Gratitude also guards your expectations. It keeps hope from becoming pressure. Instead of demanding that today be the day, gratitude says I'm thankful for today because God is still with me in it. You stop postponing joy until everything is resolved. You learn how to live fully in the present while trusting God with the future. Gratitude creates emotional resilience. When disappointment tries to knock the wind out of you, gratitude reminds you that this moment is not the full story. It helps you recover faster, believe again sooner, and hope again deeper. Gratitude breaks the cycle of comparison. When you're thankful for what God is doing in your life, you're less tempted to resent what he's doing in someone else's. You stop measuring your progress against theirs and start honoring God's unique timing for you. Gratitude keeps you grounded. It keeps your faith from becoming fragile and your expectations from becoming demanding. It teaches you to honor small beginnings and quiet progress. Every small victory becomes fuel for endurance. Gratitude also softens your prayers. You stop approaching God like a frustrated customer and start approaching him like a trusting child. Your tone changes, your posture changes, your heart opens. Gratitude invites peace into your waiting. It creates an atmosphere where anxiety struggles to survive. You can't be deeply grateful and deeply anxious at the same time. One will always silence the other. Gratitude trains your mind to look for God's hand instead of rehearsing worst-case scenarios. It keeps your faith active even when your circumstances are still. Gratitude is an act of alignment. It says, my heart agrees with what heaven already knows. It keeps you from sabotaging the wait by speaking negativity over it. What you thank God for in advance, you're preparing your heart to receive well. Gratitude enlarges your capacity to enjoy the blessing when it arrives. When you've been thankful along the way, you don't receive the answer with shock or fear, but with recognition. It feels familiar, like something you've already touched in prayer. Gratitude prepares you to steward what you asked for. It reminds you that the blessing is not a trophy for your endurance, but a gift from God's grace. Gratitude keeps you soft, humble, and aware that everything you receive flows from God's goodness. not your effort. When the answer finally shows up, gratitude ensures that praise comes before pride. It keeps you connected to the source, not just the outcome. Gratitude transforms waiting from a season you endure into a season that deepens you. It teaches you how to trust God's heart even when his hands are still unseen. It reminds you that the same God who carried you through the wait will walk with you into the fulfillment, steady, faithful, and worthy of praise long before the promise becomes visible.